Hi, everyone. We are into week 9 now of strategic planning and leadership. So we're past the halfway point. Our topic this week is facilitating creative processes. You may have noticed that we've made a little bit of a shift here in the last couple of weeks, moving a little bit away from strategy and strategic planning focus to the leadership side of the course. And so this week's readings and topic really are meant to sort of build on what we've been talking about the last couple of weeks, and in particular, building on the concept of co creation and how you go about facilitating co creative processes in an effective way. So, we have a couple of readings for this week. They're auxiliary readings. One of those is an article out of the Harvard Business Review called How to Kill Creativity. So, that talks about some of the larger managerial and leadership challenges around, how do you either facilitate or potentially deter a creative culture within an organization. The second reading is a chapter from a book called Liberating Structures, or The Surprising Power of Liberating Structures. And the chapter itself is entitled Why Microstructures Matter. So I'll talk a little bit about what that means and the implications of that in a bit. We also now, this is another one of our discussion forum weeks, so there will be forums that will cover material from weeks 8 and 9. So please try to jump in and get your first post in, hopefully no later than Wednesday, and then continue to engage and come back to those throughout the week. So let's talk a little bit about creativity and how to facilitate that. We talked a little bit earlier in the semester about the concept of sort of developing a virtual panel of experts that you can rely on to think about. Todd Henry is one of the people that has definitely been one of my sort of virtual mentors. Somebody I've read some of his books. I've also I subscribe to weekly emails from him, watch his podcast, those sorts of things. I've always really liked this quote from him, that a well-organized team of creatives, even if they are not highly skilled, will produce exponentially more and better results than a lone genius. So what he's claiming here is that, even if you have a staff that hasn't really spent a lot of time in creative processes, if you organize them well, if you use processes well, if you lead them well, they're going to produce a lot more good ideas. They're going to be more productive, and that's really the foundation of, again, sort of this engagement, this co-creative concept that we've been talking about. So we're going to build on that a little bit. So the article about how to kill creativity in an organization. It talks about 6 different sort of leadership, more organizational culture and structure type things that are important to pay attention to if you want a creative organizational culture. So one of those it talks about is this idea of challenge, that it's important, first of all, to match the people in your organization to the right assignments. If you've been in organizations, if you've been in management positions, you probably appreciate that this is not an easy thing to do. It begins by really understanding your people, knowing a lot about them, knowing what their strengths and weaknesses are, knowing what their career ambitions are, how they learn, how they communicate, those sorts of things. So that's one of the keys. And if you have a lot of people within your organization who are not necessarily in roles that fit them well, you will really have a difficult time sort of building that creative culture. Second idea is around how much freedom you give people within your organization. And so, the article talks about how if you want a creative culture within your organization, one, you have to have really clear strategic goals. People have to understand what the clear purpose of the organization is, what outcomes you're trying to achieve within your team. And then with that, you have to trust your people to do the work the way they see fit. Use their own talents and their own problem-solving skills to pursue those challenges that you set forth in your goals. It's really hard to do. Again, a lot of organizations, sort of micromanage. They use that hierarchy and the accountability of management, as opposed to sort of trusting that people can do work in very creative ways as long as you trust them and share the information that they need to do that well. Resources is part of this as well, and this is an interesting topic, and a lot of you talk about resources in your projects. This isn't necessarily a binary thing. It's, more time and more money devoted to a project doesn't necessarily mean that the outcome is going to be more creative. Less time and money doesn't mean that you're going to be less creative. And in fact, in some cases, some constraints within these resources helps drive creativity. But at the same time, it is important that the amount of resources you put into a project does communicate how valuable that is to the organization. And it's also really important to, this article talks about, it's important not to sort of create either artificial or fake deadlines. It's not a good idea to create impossibly tight deadlines to drive people, because people figure that out. They realize that they've sort of been manipulated into trying to produce faster. We also talked a little bit earlier in the semester about the creative process and how important it is to allow people to have time to explore, and how it's important to build in time for incubation. So once you've explored and you've dug into information and data, you need a little bit of time away from that. And so, unreasonably tight deadlines take away sort of those important elements of creativity. One of the things that, the book that I showed you earlier from Todd Henry, about creativity, a lot of that book is really about, in your own life, how you can spend time constantly exploring and constantly sort of incubating ideas, so that within your job, if you do face these really difficult time pressures, you're sort of prepared to respond to that. But as a manager, it's important really to sort of find the Goldilocks zone in this resource area. Provide enough time and resources, but not necessarily so much so that you're not creating some sense of urgency. Work group features is another thing that this article talks about, that it's really critical if you want creativity to put together teams that have a lot of diverse ideas, diverse backgrounds, different perspectives, but that also they are mutually supportive. And I think this is one of those things that gets sort of neglected in organizations often. It's easier when you put together a lot of like-minded people. They make decisions faster. There's less conflict. All of those things are sort of valuable in terms of a manager's perspective, that I'm not having to deal with babysitting, personality conflicts, and those sorts of things. But it also, when you have those homogenous groups that are making decisions very quickly, that's typically a red flag that means that you're not really exploring sort of the breadth of possibilities that could lead to some insightful sort of breakout thinking. Supervisory encouragement is critical. People have to understand that their work is important, how their work fits into the bigger picture. Another really important aspect of this this part of it is, as a supervisor, you can't punish failure. That really is going to be one of those things that does kill creativity. So part of this encouragement is encouraging the fact that failures are actually really good opportunities to learn, and continuing to communicate that narrative and showing through your own actions and your own leading by example that is the case. And then finally, organizational support. This is really about, sort of the big picture of building that culture of sharing and collaboration. As we get a little bit further into the semester towards the end, we will have some case studies and some reading that really kind of sheds light on this, how critical it is if you want adaptive, creative, productive teams, that you have to really share information with them in a very transparent way. Trust people with a lot more information than organizations typically have been willing to do. So those are sort of the 6 things that you'll read about in this How to Kill Creativity article. Let me say a little bit about the chapter out of the Liberating Structures book. So the title of the chapter is Why Microstructures Matter. So let's, I guess, start with clarity on what we're talking about here. What are the definitions? So let's start with defining what a macrostructure is. So the chapter talks about macrostructures being building strategies, policies, organizational structures, operating processes within an organization. And so with your projects, you are really working on a macrostructure, an organization's strategy or their strategic plan. And interestingly enough, many of you in your projects have identified that the key strategic challenge that needs to be addressed are some of these other macrostructures that the organization is perhaps growing rapidly and needs to rethink its processes and its structure, those sorts of things. So that's what we mean by macrostructures. When we talk about microstructures, we're talking about really the elements that are involved in how we operate together, how we work together. So those are things like the meeting rooms that we work together in, the office spaces where people sit, and then really the engagement processes, the presentations, meeting agendas, how we have conversations with each other. This chapter talks about there being 5 sort of conventional microstructures that almost all organizations use. And so let's talk about those a little bit. The first one is, you get together for a meeting and one person is presenting. And, I recognize the irony here that, we're talking about there are better ways to engage people in the processes, and I am engaging you through a presentation. But obviously the downside of this is that one person is in total control of the content. Everyone else who's in a part of this, the meeting, is sitting passively. They are listening or they're not listening. They're engaging or not engaging. But there are better ways than presentations to engage people in processes. The second conventional microstructure is the status report. Over the last 20 years, I would say probably 90+% of the staff meetings that I've been involved in have been simply status reports. The person who's leading the meeting just says, okay, let's go around the room and each of you report on what your teams are working on right now. So basically a status report is, you get a few more people engaged, but it's still, at any given time, it is individual presentations, one person who's engaged in the content, and then the other people just passively listening. The next one that the chapter talks about is managed discussion. So again, one person, you have more people involved in the conversation, but one person is sort of tightly controlling who gets to talk, how much they get to say, that sort of thing. Brainstorming is one that sort of feels like maybe it doesn't fit in this category of conventional microstructures, but basically the way that brainstorming is most typically done in organizations is not really conducive. It's not the way that this Liberating Structures book talks about as being ideal. I can give you a perfect example from a fairly recent example of something that I experienced. I was in a meeting with about a dozen people from across the campus. They were all communications people, marketing people, and we were working with an external consultant who was leading the session. And so this consultant was very excited about leading a brainstorming session. So she said, "This is what these are the this is the topic that we're trying to generate ideas for." And so that was it. And she said, "Okay, so who has an idea?" And there was silence for a little bit, and then, not surprisingly, the first person to raise their hand and speak up was, the most vocal, sort of most outgoing person in the group. And so he had an idea that he shared, and the consultant said, "Oh yeah, that's a great idea. Let's get somebody. We need somebody to record this." So then we took a little bit of time to get a flip chart out and a pen, and then somebody decided, "Okay, yeah. So what was that again? What was that idea?" So we got the first idea down, and it's like, "Okay, what's the next idea?" And again, there was some silence, and then finally, someone else spoke up. So this went on for about a half hour. After about 30 minutes, we had, I think, a total of 11 ideas that had been generated on our flip chart. Probably at least half of the people in the room, at least 6 of the 12, had never said a word as part of this process. And so in just a little bit, I'll talk about a more productive way. The quote from Todd Henry talks about creative teams being able to produce exponentially more. And I want to talk about how that can be done with a better brainstorming process. And then the final conventional microstructure that this chapter talks about is the open discussion. And so that is really where you just have a topic, and anyone who wants to say something can do that. Ironically, I was just in a meeting last night that used this mechanism. There were about 50 people in this particular meeting. We had an agenda that had 14 topics, and the chair of the meeting said, "All right, who has something to say about this first topic?" And again, there were 4 or 5 people who pretty much dominated the discussion. Again, we're about a half hour into it, and the chair of the meeting said, "All right, well, let's move on to question number 2." And so no structure, no process. And again, at the end of the meeting, which lasted about an hour and a half, probably 80 to 90% of the people in the room had not at any time contributed ideas to the discussion. So these are the conventional microstructures. Basically, this book says that all of these conventional microstructures make it impossible to engage more than just a small number of participants. And I think I've given you some examples of why that happens. I'm sure you've seen that as well. So how do we go about addressing this problem? We talked with the co-creation lecture last week. I talked a little bit about one of the perceived barriers to using co-creation is an idea of scale, that we simply don't have the means to, or it's inefficient for us to try to engage more than a small number of people in any sort of decision-making process or exploratory process. So that's the challenge that this book addresses, this surprising power of liberating structures. You don't have to buy the book. I recommend it. It is a good read. But they have a really remarkable set of resources available online at liberatingstructures.com. One of the things that they have there is this menu of different processes, liberating structures, that you can use depending on what sort of a challenge you're facing with your group. Are you trying to do some team building? Are you trying to just generate ideas? Are you trying to understand sort of the ecosystem that your organization works within? So I encourage you to explore some of these. Each one of these processes gives you a little bit of a recipe of, what you could potentially accomplish with this process, how you set it up, how you create the prompt, how people engage within the process. I wanted to sort of just pull out one of these, which is a foundational one that works as it actually is part of a lot of these different processes. And this is the 1, 2, 4 all process. I first encountered this a few years ago when I was engaged in a leadership development program. And we used this almost, we would meet all day, every day, or all day for 2 full days. And we did that 4 times throughout about a 9-month period. But we were always seated in in a format similar to this. It's tables with just 4 of us. And the idea of 1, 2, 4 all is that for any engagement, you start with one person. You start with what this program called I time or introvert time. And so you have your creative prompt, and then there's a period of 2, 3, 4 minutes where everyone is quiet and everyone individually is writing down their own ideas. And so immediately you can start to see how, in this diagram, if we had 32 people, immediately within 3 to 4 minutes, you could generate 100 ideas, as opposed to the 11 ideas that it took 30 minutes to generate in that brainstorming process I described. So it's really important to me. I value this process highly because I really value making sure that everyone has an opportunity to get their ideas included into engagements. And so, and it's probably not surprising that introverts are often the ones who have the best ideas, because they are often the ones who sort of sit back and observe and reflect and maybe synthesize some of of what's going on. And so it's important to give introverts an opportunity to get their ideas down and make them feel comfortable with the fact that their ideas are going to be shared across the entire group. The 2 is that after 3 or 4 minutes of individual time, you turn to your partner, one other person, and each of you share your ideas back and forth, and you build on those ideas and you clarify those ideas. So you do that for 2 or 3 minutes. Then you, as a table, the 4 of you, share your ideas together again, clarifying and building. And then each table shares with the entire group. And so, again, as this, it says engage everyone simultaneously in generating questions, ideas, and suggestions. And it says that you can do this in 12 minutes. I've used this for facilitation processes where I've used the same process over and over and over. And people very quickly, they see the pattern, they understand immediately how to, anticipate, okay, this is coming up, I'm going to start thinking about my own ideas. I know I'm going to get these ideas down. And it's also a good idea if you're using this to move people around, get them within different teams so they're not always with the same group of 4. So one of the things I want to talk about a little bit is Pixar, going back to the Todd Henry book about the accidental creative. He's talking about unskilled creative teams being really productive. When you scale this up to a team like a Pixar that are really skilled, some amazing things happen. Pixar is probably the most successful studio in history. So I wanted to share a little bit about their practice of how they engage together, how they use sort of a microstructure that you might not find in some of these other resources. And it's a process that they call plussing. And so the idea, they get together every day. They're working together in groups. None of these Pixar movies have been created by a single writer writing the script. This is all done through teams. So one of the things that they do as they work together is that they have this rule that you can't criticize a colleague's work unless you have a way to add to it. That's where the plussing comes from. You can't shoot down a colleague's work. You can only say, hey, your idea, let's take your idea, and here's how I think we could make that better. Here's how I think we could adapt that to build on it. So that's a really critical way of, one of the things in the How to Kill Creativity was that it's important to have mutually supportive groups. So this is one of those ways that you can ensure that you keep a culture of support that is not a real critical environment. Another thing that they do is that they're always discussing things that are in draft mode. And so I think I talked about this a little bit maybe earlier in the semester, that one of the things I sort of learned from my own sort of ego side is that it was not necessarily a good thing for me to try to fully develop an idea and then go sell it to other people and then be hurt when it was either criticized or picked apart to some degree. And so I sort of figured out on my own that it was much better for me to develop the germ of an idea, the seeds of an idea, and then bring people in to help me build on those. And so I think that's sort of what the Pixar model is that everything is always in draft mode and when you're engaged with folks, and it's always clear that we're going to make this draft better. They use the concept of yes and. So this is really borrowed from sort of improvisational theater. That idea that when you're working with someone else in improv, you take whatever they give you. You don't reject what they give you. You take what they give you and you build on it again. So similar to what I just said. So instead of either rejecting something outright or even sort of accepting it but then saying, yes, but there's always a yes and. How can I make this better? And that leads to the final one that I wanted to bring in. There are other parts of these, the Pixar rules, but the big part of it is that you're always making your partner look good. You're always making your teammates look better and building on that. And so that's really an important part of the sort of that supportive culture that you're trying to build. So if you have teams that are working together a lot, that's maybe easy to do. If you are working with teams that are together for the first time, it's worth up front spending a little bit of time sort of setting these ground rules and talking about how important it is to make sure that you're having a really supportive environment. So I encourage you to Google Pixar Blessing, read a little bit more about how they go about their creative process. So I mentioned the Liberating Structures. That's one book that's really good in terms of giving you some ideas about how to structure the space and structure the conversations that we have with folks. Sharing a couple of others, this book Game Storming is good, and again they also have a lot of really good online processes that you can look at, and again it's a very similar thing depending on what kind of challenge you have with the group. You can filter these processes based on what you're trying to accomplish and find a whole range of different ways you might approach engagement. And then this Memory Jogger is another one that I've used. It's something I've had around for probably 20 years. And it just, again, gives you some process to work with. So hopefully those are some ideas that are intriguing to you. You can build on those. And hopefully these are some things that you can actually apply as you are now in your projects, starting to move from sort of the exploratory diagnosis phase into the creative, developing the guiding principles and coherent actions phase. So anyway, I look forward to seeing what all of you have to say in the discussion forums this week, and we will talk again soon. Thanks, everyone.